The day I pulled a little girl out of a burning house, I had no idea my own family was destroying my grandfather's life. At least, that was the day I finally learned the truth. The fire had already consumed most of the second floor when our engine turned onto the street in western Phoenix. Thick, black smoke rolled into the afternoon sky. Neighbors stood in their driveways screaming directions at firefighters, and somewhere inside the house a terrified 8-year-old girl was trapped behind a bedroom door while flames climbed the walls around her. Moments like that have a strange way of simplifying life. Bills don't matter. Arguments don't matter. Personal problems disappear. The only thing that exists is the next decision, the next movement, the next breath. You either save someone or you don't. Everything else can wait. At least that's what I believed. I climbed the ladder through heat that felt like an open furnace. My gloves were already hot enough to hurt. Smoke filled the hallway. The visibility was almost zero. I could hear the little girl crying somewhere beyond the wall of smoke, and I followed the sound until I found her curled beside her bed, shaking so hard she could barely speak. 10 minutes later, I carried her outside. The crowd erupted. The girl's mother collapsed into tears. A local reporter started filming. People clapped. Someone shouted that I was a hero. I hated that word. Heroes were people who didn't feel fear. I felt fear every single time. I just learned how to work through it. As I handed the girl to paramedics, I finally looked at my phone. 26 missed calls. 11 text messages. 7 voicemails. Every single one from my mother. My younger brother, too. At first I thought something terrible had happened to my grandfather. He was 81 years old. Anything could happen at that age. A fall. A stroke. A heart attack. My stomach tightened immediately. I stepped away from the crowd and listened to the first voicemail. What I heard made no sense. Sarah, call me immediately. Your grandfather is accusing us of stealing from him. I stared at the screen. Then I played it again. The words still didn't make sense. My grandfather accusing my family of theft was as absurd as accusing a priest of robbing a church. The idea simply didn't fit reality. Or at least the reality I thought existed. I didn't know it then, but that voicemail was the first crack in a foundation that had been breaking apart for years. Everything I believed about my family was about to collapse. And when it did, there would be no putting it back together. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 32 years old. I've been a firefighter with the Phoenix Fire Department for nearly 10 years. Most people remember the dangerous calls, the rescues, the explosions, the dramatic stories. What they don't understand is that the hardest part of the job isn't dealing with strangers. It's dealing with your own family when they become the people who hurt you most. If someone had asked me 6 months earlier who I trusted more than anyone else in the world, the answer would have been immediate. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell. The man who practically raised me. The man who taught me what integrity looked like. The man who taught me that your word should mean something even when nobody is watching. My father left when I was 12. He didn't die. He didn't disappear. He simply decided he didn't want the responsibility anymore. One day he was there. The next day he wasn't. My mother spent years trying to hold everything together, but she became bitter after the divorce. Some people become stronger after hardship. Others become angry at the world. My mother became angry. She worked constantly, complained constantly, and slowly developed the habit of believing that everyone owed her something. The only stable person in my life was my grandfather. Robert Mitchell was a retired firefighter who had spent more than 40 years serving the city. Even after retirement, people recognized him. Older firefighters would stop and shake his hand. Police officers knew his name. Restaurant owners greeted him personally. When I was a little girl, walking beside him felt like walking beside a celebrity. But what impressed me wasn't his reputation. It was his character. He never lied, never exaggerated, never made promises he couldn't keep. If he said he would be somewhere at 3 o'clock, he arrived at 2:55. If he said he would help someone, he helped them. If he said something was wrong, it was wrong. Simple. Reliable. Strong. The kind of man that seems increasingly rare in the modern world. When I told my family I wanted to become a firefighter, my mother nearly laughed. She said it wasn't a career for women. My younger brother, Jason, thought it was hilarious. He told everyone I'd quit within a month. Only my grandfather believed in me. I still remember graduation day. Hundreds of people filled the academy auditorium. Families took photographs. Recruits stood proudly in uniform. When they called my name, I looked into the crowd and saw my grandfather standing before anyone else, applauding, smiling, proud. For a brief moment, I noticed tears in his eyes. It was the first and only time I had ever seen Robert Mitchell cry. Years later, after my grandmother passed away, We became even closer. Every Sunday I visited him. Sometimes we talked about sports. Sometimes about work. Sometimes about absolutely nothing. Those Sundays became a routine neither of us ever discussed, but both of us quietly depended on. He never asked for help, never complained, never wanted sympathy, which is exactly why the phone call 3 months earlier had frightened me so much. I was finishing a 24-hour shift when my phone rang. His voice sounded different. Not weak. Not confused. Just worried. And that alone was enough to make my heart race. "Sarah," he said. "Hey, Grandpa. I need to ask you something." I immediately sat down, because my grandfather never asked for anything, not from anyone. What happened? There was a long silence. Long enough for me to hear him breathing. Long enough for me to know something was very wrong. Finally he spoke. "Can you come by tomorrow?" "Of course. Don't tell your mother." I frowned. The request was so unusual that it immediately got my attention. "Why not?" Another silence. Then he said something that would change my life forever. "I think someone is taking money from my accounts." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" When he answered, his voice was barely above a whisper, and yet those words hit harder than any explosion I had ever heard. "I think your mother and Jason are stealing from me." For the rest of that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about what my grandfather had said, not because I believed him. Because I didn't. At least not completely. I trusted Robert Mitchell more than anyone else in the world, but I also knew what age could do to people. 81 wasn't young. Memory slips happened. Confusion happened. Misunderstandings happened. By the time I got home after the fire, I had almost convinced myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe he forgot writing a check. Maybe he overlooked a payment. Maybe the bank had made a mistake. Maybe my mother was helping him manage his finances and he simply didn't remember authorizing something. There were dozens of possibilities. Stealing was the least likely one. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The next morning was Sunday. I drove across Phoenix to the neighborhood where my grandfather had lived for nearly 40 years. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. The same white fence. The same oak tree in the front yard. The same American flag hanging beside the porch. Nothing looked different. But the moment I stepped inside, I could feel something had changed. My grandfather was sitting at the kitchen table. Several folders were spread out in front of him. Bank statements. Receipts. Handwritten notes. A calculator. His reading glasses rested beside a coffee cup. He looked exhausted, not physically. Emotionally. That frightened me more than anything, because Robert Mitchell was not a man who scared easily. He looked up when I entered. "Morning, kiddo." His smile was weak. Forced. I sat across from him. "You okay?" "No." The answer came immediately. No pretending, no hiding. Just honesty. The way he had always been. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he pushed a stack of papers toward me. "Look." I picked up the first statement. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Monthly expenses. Utility bills. Insurance payments. Property taxes. Normal retirement account activity. Then I noticed a transfer, $2,500. Electronic withdrawal. 3 months earlier. I looked at another statement. $3,000. Another transfer. Then another. Then another. My stomach slowly tightened. "What's this?" My grandfather leaned back in his chair. "That's exactly what I've been trying to figure out." I continued flipping through pages. The transfers weren't random. They appeared every few weeks. Sometimes $2,000. Sometimes $3,000. Sometimes $5,000. Always electronic. Always authorized somehow. Always disappearing from his accounts. The total amount made my pulse quicken. I grabbed a calculator. Added the numbers, then added them again. And again, because I thought I had made a mistake. I hadn't. Nearly $90,000. Gone. I stared at the final number. 90,000? My grandfather nodded slowly. $91,742. I looked up. "When did you notice?" "A few months ago." "Why didn't you call me sooner?" His eyes drifted toward the window. Because he already knew the answer, and so did I. Because the people he suspected weren't strangers, they were family. Family members always get the benefit of the doubt. Even when they don't deserve it. Especially when they don't deserve it. "I wanted to believe there was another explanation," he said quietly. "I understood that. God, I understood that. Because I was doing exactly the same thing. I looked down at another statement. One detail suddenly caught my attention. The destination account. The last 4 digits repeated several times. The same account, the same recipient. Over and over. Do you know whose account this is? His jaw tightened. Yes. I looked up. For the first time since arriving, I saw genuine anger in his eyes. Not confusion. Not sadness. Anger. The bank manager helped me find out. My chest tightened. I already knew what he was about to say. I just didn't want to hear it. It belongs to Jason. The room became very quiet. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for him to say he was joking, waiting for reality to return. It didn't. Jason. My younger brother. The same brother who always seemed short on money despite earning a decent salary. The same brother who constantly leased expensive cars. The same brother who somehow managed to take luxury vacations every year. The same brother who always had an excuse whenever anyone questioned his finances. I remembered the new truck, the expensive watch, the trips to Las Vegas, the designer clothes, the constant spending. Pieces started falling into place. And I hated every second of it. No. The word escaped my mouth automatically. My grandfather didn't respond. No, I repeated. There has to be another explanation. Like what? I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because for the first time I couldn't think of one. He watched me carefully, not judging, not angry. Simply waiting. Finally, I asked the question neither of us wanted to ask. What about Mom? His expression darkened. Then he reached for another folder. This one was thinner, more organized. Inside were printed emails, property records, bank correspondence. Documents. Lots of documents. I flipped through them. Then I froze. A signature. My grandfather's signature. At least it appeared to be. Except something felt wrong. The handwriting looked similar, but not identical. I examined it more closely. The letters were shaky, uneven, forced, like someone had spent hours practicing before finally attempting to copy it. What is this? His face hardened. Power of attorney paperwork. I looked at him, then at the document, then back at him. My pulse started pounding. Grandpa. He nodded. I never signed it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, because if that document was fake, everything changed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a family disagreement about money. It was fraud. Deliberate. Calculated. Criminal. And suddenly my grandfather's fear made perfect sense. I looked down again. The listed representative authorized to act on his behalf was clearly named. Linda Mitchell, my mother. The kitchen seemed colder. The sunlight through the windows felt distant. For 32 years I had believed I knew my family. Now I wasn't sure I knew them at all. My grandfather folded his hands together. I didn't call you because I wanted someone to take my side. His voice was steady now. Stronger. I called you because I need someone I can trust. The words hit harder than anything else that morning. Because I knew exactly what he meant. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure where this investigation would lead. But I knew one thing. If someone had stolen from Robert Mitchell, if someone had forged documents, if someone had betrayed the man who spent his entire life protecting other people, I was going to find out exactly what happened. Even if it destroyed my family, and deep down, for the first time, I was beginning to suspect that it already had. 3 weeks later, everything finally came crashing down. The truth had a strange way of doing that. For years, my mother and brother had carefully built a version of reality that benefited them. They lied a little at first. Then a little more. Then they discovered that every successful lie made the next one easier. People rarely become monsters overnight. Most of the time, they simply take one small step after another until they no longer recognize the person staring back at them in the mirror. The investigation moved faster than any of us expected. Once the bank discovered forged documents, their fraud department became involved. Once attorneys reviewed the paperwork, things became even worse. The signature on the power of attorney was fake. Expert analysis confirmed it. Security footage showed Jason accompanying my mother to multiple meetings with bank representatives. Electronic records connected the transfers directly to accounts controlled by both of them. There were emails, text messages, financial records, more evidence than anyone needed. By the end of the second week, neither of them could deny what had happened anymore. Yet somehow they still tried. My mother claimed she was protecting the money. Jason claimed he intended to pay everything back. Both explanations fell apart immediately. Nearly $100,000 had disappeared. Luxury vacations, truck payments, credit card debt, designer purchases, casino trips. The money wasn't being protected. It was being spent. The final confrontation happened at my grandfather's house. The same kitchen, the same table, the same place where he had first shown me the statements. Only this time, everyone was there. My mother, Jason, their attorney, my grandfather, and me. The atmosphere felt heavier than any fire scene I had ever entered. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, my grandfather broke the silence. He looked directly at my mother, not angry, not emotional, just disappointed. The disappointment seemed to hurt her more than anger ever could. Why? The single word hung in the room. My mother looked away, because I deserved it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even my grandfather looked stunned. She continued. I spent years taking care of this family. Nobody answered. I struggled after the divorce. Silence. I sacrificed everything. Still silence. Then my grandfather nodded slowly. Lots of people sacrifice things. His voice remained calm. Most of them don't steal. My mother's face hardened. For a moment I saw the bitterness she had carried for years. The resentment, the belief that the world owed her compensation for every disappointment she had ever experienced. I was going to inherit it eventually. My grandfather stared at her. The room became completely silent. Then he said something I will never forget. No. The word landed like a hammer. You were going to receive whatever I chose to leave you. He leaned forward, but inheritance is a gift. His eyes never left hers. It is not an entitlement. For the first time, my mother had no response. Jason finally spoke. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. I made mistakes. My grandfather looked at him. Mistakes? Jason swallowed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then my grandfather pointed toward the stack of documents. Taking $90,000 over several years isn't a mistake. His voice remained steady. That's a decision. Jason lowered his eyes, and in that moment, I knew he finally understood. Not the legal consequences, not the financial consequences, the personal ones. The relationship was over. Trust once broken can sometimes be repaired, but betrayal on this scale leaves scars that never fully disappear. 2 months later, the case was settled. Most of the money was recovered through asset seizures and repayment agreements. Not all of it, but enough. My grandfather wasn't interested in revenge. He simply wanted the truth acknowledged. He wanted accountability. Most of all, he wanted peace. The legal consequences belonged to the courts. The emotional consequences belonged to our family, and those consequences lasted much longer. My mother moved away. Jason rarely contacted anyone. Family holidays stopped. Birthdays became quieter. Some relationships survived. Others didn't. People often assume that justice feels satisfying. Sometimes it does, but sometimes justice simply means accepting reality. And reality can hurt. 6 months later, I was sitting beside my grandfather on the front porch watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky orange and gold. The air was warm. The neighborhood was quiet. For the first time in nearly a year, neither of us had anything difficult to discuss. We simply sat together. The way we always had. Eventually he spoke. You know what hurts most? I looked at him. What? He smiled sadly. Not the money. I wasn't surprised. Money had never mattered much to Robert Mitchell. What is it then? He stared toward the horizon, the realization that strangers treated me better than my own family. For a moment I didn't know what to say. Then I reached over and squeezed his hand. He smiled. A genuine smile this time. And suddenly I realized something important. My mother and brother had taken money. They had taken trust. They had taken years of peace, but they had failed to take the most important thing. The people who truly loved him. Those people were still there. I was still there. And I always would be. 1 year later, on his 82nd birthday, our local fire department invited my grandfather to a ceremony honoring retired firefighters. Hundreds of people attended. Firefighters, police officers, neighbors, friends, people whose lives he had touched over decades of service. When his name was announced, the entire room stood. The applause seemed endless. I looked around and saw something my mother and brother never understood. Respect cannot be stolen. Character cannot be forged. A lifetime of integrity cannot be transferred from one account to another. Those things have to be earned. My grandfather had earned every bit of it. As the crowd continued applauding, he looked toward me. For a brief moment, his eyes filled with tears, just like they had on the day I graduated from the fire academy. He smiled. I smiled back, and in that moment I realized the fire that nearly destroyed our family had finally burned itself out. What remained wasn't wealth. It wasn't inheritance. It wasn't property. It was something far more valuable: truth. And sometimes the truth is worth more than every dollar in the bank. My grandfather passed away peacefully 3 years later. In his sleep. Without pain. Without fear. The way every good firefighter hopes to leave this world. At the reading of his will, there were no surprises, no dramatic revelations, no final acts of revenge. Just one sentence written in his own handwriting near the end. A message intended specifically for me. It read, "Sarah, thank you for running toward the fire when everyone else ran away." I cried when I read it. Not because of the inheritance, not because he was gone, but because I finally understood what he meant. The greatest fire I ever faced wasn't in a burning building. It was the one that consumed my family. And when it mattered most, I didn't run away. I stayed. Just like he taught me. And that made all the difference.